Hey everyone! Welcome back to Hey English. I'm Philip.
And I'm Sara. We're thrilled to have you with us today. We've got a really special topic lined up for you.
That's right. Today, we're diving into something close to our hearts: lessons from grandparents. It's a topic filled with wisdom, nostalgia, and some fantastic English learning opportunities.
Absolutely. Grandparents often share some of the most valuable lessons, and we'll be exploring a few of those gems today. Plus, we'll be breaking down some vocabulary, grammar tips, and idioms that come up in these lessons.
So, whether you're sipping your morning coffee or just relaxing, we hope you enjoy this episode. We'll start by sharing some of our favorite lessons from our grandparents and explain the English language elements behind them.
It's going to be a fun and insightful journey. And remember, by learning these phrases and idioms, you're not just improving your English, you're also connecting with timeless wisdom.
So, let's get started. Grab a comfy seat, and let's delve into the valuable lessons our grandparents have taught us.
We can't wait to share these moments with you. Let's go.
So, let's dive right into it. Sara, when you think about the lessons your grandparents taught you, is there one that really stands out?
Absolutely. My grandmother was full of wisdom, but one thing she always used to say was, "A stitch in time saves nine." It's one of those old sayings that might seem simple, but it carries so much weight. She used it to remind me that taking care of small problems early can prevent them from becoming big ones later on. I remember one time when I put off fixing a tiny tear in my favorite dress. Before I knew it, that little tear turned into a huge rip, and I ended up having to toss the dress.
Oh, I can relate to that. It's such a practical lesson, but it also applies to so many areas of life, whether it's about maintaining relationships, staying on top of work, or even just keeping things organized. And I love how this saying is a great example of a metaphor in English. It's not just about sewing, but about life in general.
Exactly. And speaking of metaphors, another lesson my grandfather taught me was, don't count your chickens before they hatch. He used to say that whenever I got too excited about something before it actually happened. It was his way of teaching me to be patient and not to get ahead of myself.
That's such a classic. It's all about managing expectations, right? And it's also a great idiom to know. English is full of these kinds of phrases that don't always make sense literally but carry a deeper meaning.
Definitely. How about you, Philip? Any memorable lessons from your grandparents?
Oh, for sure. My grandpa was a big believer in the idea of measure twice, cut once. He was a carpenter, so for him, this was literal advice: always double check your measurements before cutting a piece of wood. But over time, I realized he was talking about more than just carpentry. It's really about being thorough and careful in everything you do.
I love that. It's such a practical piece of advice, but like so many of these sayings, it also has a deeper meaning. It teaches us to be mindful and to think things through before making decisions.
Exactly. And it's interesting how these lessons have stayed with us, even as we've grown older. They're simple, yet so powerful. It just goes to show how much impact our grandparents have on our lives, even in the smallest of ways.
And it's amazing how these phrases are passed down through generations, becoming a part of our everyday language. They're not just lessons, but also a connection to our roots and our culture.
That's so true. And I think that's what makes these conversations so special. They're not just about learning English, they're about connecting with our past and bringing those timeless lessons into our modern lives.
Absolutely. It's about preserving that wisdom and making sure it continues to guide us, just like it did for our grandparents.
Speaking of those timeless lessons, I think it's a great opportunity for us to break down some of the vocabulary and grammar we've been using. These old sayings are packed with language that's really worth exploring.
Definitely. Let's start with "a stitch in time saves nine." The word stitch is a good one to look at. It's commonly used as a noun, meaning a single loop of thread in sewing, but it can also be a verb. When you say, to stitch something, you're talking about the action of sewing.
And that's a great example of how English words can have multiple meanings depending on their use. The verb stitch here carries the idea of fixing something before it gets worse, which ties back to the lesson of being proactive.
Exactly. Another interesting word from that phrase is saves. It's often used in the context of rescuing or keeping something safe, but in this saying, it means to prevent or to avoid. It's fascinating how one word can carry so many different connotations depending on the context.
That's true. And then there's measure twice, cut once. The word measure is another versatile one. As a verb, it means to determine the size, amount, or degree of something. As a noun, it refers to the actual amount or standard used in measuring.
Right. And cut is a great example of a word that's both a noun and a verb as well. As a verb, it means to divide something with a sharp tool, and as a noun, it can refer to the result of that action, like a cut in the fabric. It's simple but effective, especially in the context of this lesson.
And let's not forget about the grammar in these phrases. Take measure twice, cut once. It's an imperative sentence. Imperative sentences are used to give commands or advice. In this case, the sentence is telling us to take action carefully, and the subject you is implied.
That's a great point. Imperatives are really common in English, especially in advice or instructions. They're direct and to the point, which makes them easy to remember and apply.
And then there's the use of idioms like, don't count your chickens before they hatch. Idioms are phrases where the meaning isn't always obvious from the individual words. It's important to learn these because they're so frequently used in everyday conversation, and they add color and depth to the language.
Absolutely. Understanding idioms is key to becoming fluent in English because they convey so much more than just their literal meaning. They often reflect cultural values and common sense wisdom, which makes them really powerful.
And the more you understand the context behind these phrases, the better you'll get at using them naturally in conversation. That's one of the great things about learning English through stories and lessons like these. It helps everything click into place.
Exactly. It's about connecting the language with real-life experiences and understanding the deeper meanings behind the words. That's what makes learning so much more engaging and effective.
So now that we've explored some of the vocabulary and grammar behind these sayings, let's talk about how we can actually apply these lessons in our modern lives. These aren't just old-fashioned ideas, they're still incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely. Take a stitch in time saves 9, for example. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to let little problems slide, thinking you'll deal with them later. But whether it's at work, in relationships, or even with your personal health, addressing issues early on can save you a lot of trouble down the road.
That's so true. It's a lesson in being proactive. If you think about it, this idea applies perfectly to things like project management. If you catch a mistake early in the process, it's much easier and less costly to fix than if you wait until the end.
Exactly. And what about measure twice, cut once? It's all about preparation and careful planning. In our modern context, it reminds us to take the time to think things through before making decisions, whether it's a big career move or even just planning out your day.
It's such a valuable mindset. With all the emphasis on speed and efficiency these days, it's easy to rush into things. But this saying teaches us the importance of slowing down, double-checking our work, and making sure we're making informed choices.
And don't count your chickens before they hatch is another one that's just as relevant now as it was back then. It's a great reminder to stay grounded and not to make assumptions about outcomes before they actually happen.
Definitely. It's especially important in our goal-oriented culture. We're often encouraged to focus on results, but this idiom reminds us to be patient and not to get ahead of ourselves. It's about managing expectations and staying realistic.
And these lessons aren't just about personal development, they're also about how we interact with others. For example, being mindful of how we communicate can prevent misunderstandings and build stronger relationships. These old sayings often encourage us to think before we speak or act, which is timeless advice.
Exactly. It's about being thoughtful in everything we do. Whether it's in our personal lives or our professional ones, these lessons from our grandparents can guide us in making better decisions and living more meaningful lives.
And I think that's why these sayings have lasted for so long. They're simple, but they carry a lot of wisdom. They remind us that, no matter how much the world changes, the core principles of being careful, thoughtful, and patient will always be important.
So true. It's amazing how something our grandparents said decades ago can still resonate with us today. It just goes to show that good advice really does stand the test of time.
And that's why it's so important to keep these lessons alive, to remember them, and to pass them on to future generations. They're not just words, they're tools for living well in any era.
What's really fascinating about these sayings is how much they reveal about the culture they come from. They're not just phrases, they're snapshots of the values and beliefs that were important to our grandparents and their generation.
Absolutely. For instance, sayings like "a stitch in time saves nine" and "measure twice" cut once highlight a culture that values hard work, careful planning, and attention to detail. These were essential qualities in a time when people relied heavily on their hands-on skills and had to make the most of what they had.
Exactly. These expressions reflect a mindset where nothing was wasted, and everything had a purpose. It's a reminder of how resourceful and resilient past generations were. Even today, these values are still important, especially when we talk about sustainability and being mindful of our resources.
And if you look at something like "don't count your chickens before they hatch," it shows a culture that valued patience and caution. It's about being wise enough to understand that not everything is guaranteed and that it's better to wait and see how things unfold before making assumptions.
It's interesting how these lessons also teach humility. They remind us that, despite our best efforts, we don't always have control over the outcomes. It's a very grounded approach to life, one that encourages us to stay humble and adaptable.
And these sayings aren't just limited to one culture. Many of them have equivalents in other languages and traditions, which shows that these values are universal. They resonate with people across different backgrounds because they speak to common human experiences.
That's so true. It's one of the reasons why these lessons feel so timeless. They tap into fundamental truths about life that everyone can relate to, no matter where they come from.
And I think that's why it's so important to reflect on these sayings and what they mean for us today. They're more than just words, they're connections to our past and guides for our future. By understanding the cultural context behind them, we can appreciate their wisdom even more.
Exactly. And it also makes us more aware of the wisdom we're passing on to future generations. What lessons will our grandchildren look back on and find valuable? It's something to think about.
It really is. These cultural connections remind us that we're all part of a bigger story, one that spans generations. And by holding on to these lessons, we keep that story alive, learning from the past while we build our future.
Well said, Sarah. It's all about keeping that wisdom alive and making sure it continues to guide us in a world that's always changing. And with that, we've come full circle. We've explored the wisdom of our grandparents, broken down some valuable English phrases, and reflected on how these lessons still hold meaning in our lives today.
It's been such a meaningful conversation. I hope it's inspired you all to think about the lessons your own grandparents might have passed down, and how those words of wisdom continue to shape who you are.
And if you're learning English, I hope this discussion has also helped you see how rich and layered the language can be. These sayings are more than just expressions, they're windows into culture, history, and shared experiences.
That's right. Language is so much more than words, it's about connection, understanding, and passing on what matters most. So, whether you're here to improve your English or just to enjoy the stories, we're glad you joined us today.
Thank you all for tuning in. Remember to keep these lessons close, share them with others, and maybe even start some conversations of your own. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode.
We've got plenty more to talk about, and we can't wait to share it with you. Until next time, take care and keep those timeless lessons alive.
See you next time, everyone.